I mean, it's Nathan there. If you wanted to swap.
It's okay. No, no, I'm not that worried about it. But I will have to open it up.
Okay.
And it's just in case. It should have enough juice, but if not, I'll be right back, sir.
Did they need it?
They need it, they don't need it, they need it, they don't need it.
Okay. Am I supposed to know how to turn the projector on here?
Oh, yeah. Well, it's plugged in. There we go.
There we go. All right.
I just want to plug in all the way. Is that gonna work?
Yeah. This on.
It is. Now we can. I'll leave it up to you if you want to wait 4 or 5 minutes.
Sure.
People are still milling around. That break was too short, I think. Might as well.
You can close some of the doors if you
Whatever. Okay, kind of back in a little closet here, it feels like, huh? Okie dokie, I guess I'm supposed to take this off. I assume I'm audible online and in our small little room here. Hi, so I'm Sarah Collier. I am with the University of Washington Food System, Nutrition, and Health program. And I'm talking this afternoon about what we can learn from COVID about resilience in Washington's agriculture. I will say that my background is more in the sort of crop and soil sciences and ag sustainability broadly. But since joining UW, I've sort of become a jack of all trades, and one of the pressing needs in this last year and a half or so was to gather data on what's going on with COVID in the agricultural community. And so that's one of the things I've been doing and what I'll talk about today. Before joining UW, I was with Tilth Alliance and was one of the organizers of the 2017 conference. It's really nice to be back here as a presenter instead of an organizer, very much more relaxed. So, alrighty. So the really brief what and why of what we're going to hear about this afternoon, I'm going to talk about the results of surveys and interviews conducted, but mostly with farmers as well as with ag stakeholders over the past year and a half about what's been going on. And the reason that I and others have been doing this is primarily just to gather information about impacts and adaptations as they happen, so that we can then analyze it analyze that information and turn it around to help inform ongoing recovery efforts, to help build resilience to future challenges, and to provide the data back to the community to help producers in Washington tell their story. And so for those of you who are in the audience who are farmers or who work with the farm community, most of what I'm going to tell you today isn't going to be news because you've lived it. The value that I hope comes out of this is basically to point out that we have this aggregated data now that's available to you as a resource to help tell your story. There's some material that's published now and that will be published in the next couple of weeks that's available. And just sort of, to provide broader context for what the numbers say about what's been happening. Before saying anything else, I want to acknowledge some important pieces here. One is that the centrality of farmers in everything I'm going to be talking about. This is about interviews and surveys with farmers who participated and spent their time anonymously, taking time to explain what's been happening. And also other organizations like Tilth Alliance and many others who participated as stakeholders either through being interviewees who took time to talk with us about what was going on, or who gave feedback on survey design and helped disseminate surveys, all kinds of things. So this is really, the ag community is very central to everything I'm going to talk about. Most of what I'm going to share is also based on unfunded research, which is relevant in the context of this was a COVID responsive thing. Everyone just had to figure out how to get done what needed to be done without a lot of resources. We did, for part of it, receive funding more recently from WSDA, which has been fantastic, and a little bit from the UW Nutritional Sciences program as well. The other part of it is the people, the study team. One really key piece is that everything I'm going to show has been done in full collaboration between UW, WSU, and WSDA to sort of rapidly put together this research team to get done what we needed to. Another important point I want to make is that a lot of this research was done by graduate students at UW, Anna Fogel and Danny Ledeka, who were doing this as part of their master's thesis research. And then we have a really broad study team. A number of food systems researchers at UW contributed to this, and our WSU and WSDA collaborators as well, which are well known to most people in this sphere. So it's a really fully collaborative effort, and it relied on the work of a lot of folks. I also want to acknowledge that this research team is not as diverse in terms of race or gender or even age as we would ideally like to see. And a lot of that is a product of the rapid, the lack of time and the lack of resources and the need to just get it done with whoever was available to do the work. But it is worth pointing out. The final thing, just a little more context. That was a lot of UW folks in the research team. And this is a relatively new, sort of, in a way, new research presence for UW. But this is from the UW Food Systems Program, which is a collection of researchers and educators at UW focused on food systems. We span all stages of the supply chain from production to consumption and bring together a lot of different disciplines from agriculture to nutrition with a broad emphasis on health, including public health, global health, environmental health. Okay, so, is that always bouncing?
I think it's screen at the moment.
Okay, sorry about that. Anyway, if you can bear to think back for a second to March of 2020 and what was going on in your world. If you're, as a farmer, we'll talk a lot about what was going on for farmers at that time, but an incredible number of pivots and adaptations and dealing with challenges related to marketing, production, employee health and safety, all kinds of things. As an ag service provider, all kinds of pivoting to working online and trying to figure out what was the most critical problem, where the need was, what resources could be brought to bear. As educators, we were swamped with getting classes online and making sure students were okay in this new environment and everything. And then as researchers, which is what I'm talking to you as today, we were asking what is being done right now and what's not being done, and what's needed from the research community to swivel over and address. And one of the things that became evident was that there was a need for broad assessment of the pandemic's impacts and adaptations that were being made among Washington farms. So that's sort of where this comes from, is that early in the pandemic asking, okay, what do we really need from our research community? So this is sort of, the purple thing there is sort of a rough timeline showing different data collection efforts that have gone on over the last year and a half. So the very earliest one for us in Washington was WSDA did a really rapid economic impact survey in May of 2020, so just less than 2 months into the pandemic. So, we then collaborated with WSU and WSDA to put together those next to a couple of interviews with small and direct market farmers to understand more deeply what was at the root of impacts that they were experiencing. And then a broad, that WaFarm COVID Impacts and Adaptation Survey, which was a much broader look at what was going on across the board for all farms in Washington. And that was conducted at the end of last year, so last December and January. That brought in some other sources of information too, looked at what had already been done, and then figured out what do we need to find out for our state, for our producers. And then I'll also touch on a little bit, we have more recently done additional interviews with stakeholders across the food system in Washington, so including producers and producer representing organizations, commodity commissions, supply chain representatives, and a lot of food access organizations as well, to get a better picture of what this looks like sort of food system-wide in Washington. And all of these sort of data collection efforts have been feeding into a couple of products that are available to everyone. So one is basically a research brief that summarizes some of the high points that came out of that statewide end of season survey, and I've got a few copies of it here if anyone wants. So that is something that's available online as well, and a lot of what I'm going to talk about today is in there. What's not in there is in another piece that's coming out hopefully in just about a week from now, and that combines some additional sources of data. There's been a lot of effort going on in our state to also look at food access and availability and where some of the hang-ups are in terms of limitations around food access and what's being done to solve those. Just sort of the same stuff I'm going to talk about on the ag side has been going on the food access side as well. So all of that is being pulled and packaged together into this report that UW is generating for WSDA about the state of the state's food system over the past year and a half and what COVID can tell us and suggest for the future and for recovery. So that'll be something that's available too. And so that's sort of some of the point today, is to walk through what are some of the things that you can find in these reports, and if you need to have data to point to, here's where you can go to get it. So I will mainly talk about what came out of that farm survey, statewide farm survey, and then pepper in bits and pieces from the other, all the other data collection tools in there as well. So I'll talk a little bit about what that survey consisted of first, and we don't need to read all of those words up there. But again, this was something developed jointly by UW, WSU, and WSDA, mainly because, first of all, we were the three organizations that were likely to feel that, you know, it was our job to do this as public research organizations or public institutions. And we definitely wanted to avoid survey fatigue. Everybody was being over-surveyed last year, and we didn't want to contribute to any of that. We wanted to make sure to collect all the data that everybody needed in sort of one fell swoop, and not bother anybody more than necessary. And also bringing together different networks, different sources of expertise, different ways to reach different communities. So that's sort of where the survey came from and who did it. As I said, we sort of looked at what else had been done around the country. There were lots of rapid response surveys going on in the summer. So we had to look at what they were asking. We talked with a lot of stakeholders in our state about what were we seeing in Washington, where do we have information gaps, what kinds of questions should be asked of the farm community to fill those information gaps. And so we developed the survey from that, designed to fill multiple needs. So designed to just assess impacts, help tell producers stories with data, figure out what helped, what hindered, and how we can be informed in the future. Like what adaptations were undertaken that were successful, what can we learn about resilience to this shock that can tell us about resilience in the future, which I'll touch on later here this afternoon. And then also, what are some of the concerns and sort of the outlook and how are we feeling looking towards the future. So the survey was an end of season survey, so end of season last year in December and January. And we asked, you know, a lot of categories of questions. We asked information about farm characteristics, right, so we can divide the data then based on different types of farms. We asked sort of pre and post COVID questions, so what were things before COVID in 2019, what did they look like at the end of 2020? We asked very specific questions about how farmers felt that COVID had impacted their operation. We looked at resource utilization, as well as asking about future outlooks and concerns. So I'll talk a little bit about then, you know, the characteristics, who we ended up getting responses from, and then what we saw in terms of impacts, what we saw in terms of adaptation strategies, and what that can tell us about resilience and sort of what we can take forward to the future. And I want to just say, feel free to stop me with questions at any point, and there'll be plenty of time for questions at the end as well. So whatever you prefer. But so I'll just give some sort of like snapshots of the respondent characteristics for the survey so that you know who I'm talking about. So we ended up with 265 fully completed responses, lots of others that didn't complete the survey. But so we had these 265 responses spread across the state, pretty decent statewide coverage overall, 33 out of our 39 counties, with the heaviest density in King County and other Puget Sound counties. But we did have some pretty good density in Central and Eastern Washington counties as well. We had really good representation, especially from vegetable and fruit producers, as well as meat and egg producers. Didn't have as much response from dairy, shellfish, hops, or wine grape growers. Some of the, you know, the response rate can have to do with the point in the season for different types of production. Asking anyone to take time to fill out a survey in the, you know, the stress and chaos of last year was a big ask. And it's also worth pointing out, though, that of those who did respond, more than 3/4, you know, checked multiple categories here. And that's not a surprise to us. We know that farms in Washington are extremely diverse. And so it just certainly came through in what we can see in the data. So this is showing the, you know, how respondents group in terms of farm size. Over on the left is by acreage farmed, and on the right is by annual revenue. So we had about 2/3 of respondents farm less than 50 acres, and about 70% of respondents had annual revenues of less than $250,000, so would be categorized as small farms. So the majority of respondents were small farmers, as we would expect in our state, and being, you know, representative of a state that has a majority of small farms by the numbers. But we had responses from all scales, all the way up to, you know, over $1 million revenue, over 2,000 acres farmed. We also asked about farm age, not the age of the farmer, but the age of the farm business. And we had a really good mix of beginning farmers and experienced farmers. Notably, you know, 40% there had been farming for over 20 years. And we can do all kinds of sort of cross-tabulation of the different characteristics and stuff. One thing that's just kind of neat to look at is breaking it down by farm size. So you see small farms here and large farms, and then looking at that by the other characteristics. So when you look at it by farm age, you can see that for small farms, it's close to half and half established versus new. So you have a lot of small farms that are well established, of course. But when you're looking at large farms, you know, they are majority established. There are very few new, very large farms, which certainly goes into the difficulty of accessing farmland and starting a farm business and all kinds of things. By number of products produced, among small farms, there was a higher frequency of production of multiple products. But even so, among larger farms, still over half produced multiple categories of products. And then in terms of number of marketing channels utilized, which was very relevant during the pandemic and just in order to sort of pivot different ways during the pandemic, both small and large farms, the majority already utilized multiple marketing channels, but that was slightly more common among smaller farms, as we would expect. So that gives you just an idea of who responded to the survey, so who we'll be sharing information about. I'll talk first about just some of the, like, what do the numbers tell us about impacts, about the impacts that we all know to be true and have lived already, but what do the numbers tell us? So one way to look at impacts is to see who was impacted, what types of characteristics of farmers and farms were most heavily impacted. So what you're seeing there, the bars are showing the percent of producers who said that they had that they were negatively impacted overall by the pandemic. So just taking everything into account, did the pandemic have a negative effect on your business during 2020? And one thing that jumps out there is that there's a lot of unevenness. So you're looking at different categories: new farmers, female farmers, BIPOC farmers. You have military veterans, different farm sizes, different farms locations, and there's some unevenness. So we see that those types of farms or farmers who were most likely to say they were negatively impacted by the pandemic were large farms compared to small. There were farms in Eastern Washington compared to Western Washington. They were military veteran and BIPOC farmers who disproportionately said that they had experienced negative impacts. We also, beyond just looking at broad negative impacts, we asked about financial impacts, so those who had experienced revenue loss in 2020 compared to the year before. And the trend is pretty much the same. There is some variation, but it's basically the same trend of those who were most heavily impacted. So the impacts were uneven for different types of farms and different types of farmers. Another thing that we can see looking at this type of data is just the difference between those two things: overall negative impacts and financial negative impacts. So about 60% of producers across the board, when you sort of average it all up, about 60% said they were negatively impacted by the pandemic, which is a large percent, but actually then that also does mean there were 40% who either weren't impacted or who actually were positively impacted. And I'll talk a little bit about those folks later on. But so the 60% said they were negatively impacted. Only 48% said that they had lost revenue due to the pandemic. And so that gap between 60 and 48 just highlights for us, sort of in numbers, that there are factors beyond just revenue that shape experience during a crisis, right? So it's not all about money. There are more people who are negatively impacted, even if they weren't hurt financially. So that kind of brings me to the next type of impact, which is just thinking about hidden impacts, right? So the places where even things that we would think maybe by the numbers are success stories, those success stories still come at a cost. So at the end of last year, 43% of producers said that they felt stressed all or most of the time. Nearly a quarter said that they were reported experiencing moderate to severe anxiety or depression. All of this, to be successful, to pivot, to adapt, to make this work takes a lot. It takes mental energy, takes pulling from sort of well springs or stocks of resources. Other types of hardships, we'll look at labor and having to let employees go, trying to do backflips to keep employees on board, all kinds of things that really take a toll in hidden ways that are not necessarily financial. And then another type of sort of hidden impact is this idea of stifled growth. And this is a phenomenon that some farms reported. And I think this quote here, which is a little small on the screen, so I'll read it, kind of encapsulates this. This is from a farmer who we interviewed, who said, we were expecting a 25% increase in gross sales this year, but instead our gross sales are just under 12% higher than they were last year. So we're that odd scenario where COVID definitely had a negative impact on markets. However, that's not reflected in our accounting, right? So they look like they actually grew financially, but they were on a trajectory. They were banking on more growth than they saw. And so they actually were hurt, even though it looks like they did well, to people who don't understand what phase of trajectory and farm growth and development that farm was in. So throughout, talking about COVID impacts and adaptations and everything, when we talk about adaptation, or when we think about it, we want to think about what worked, and then we also always want to think about what did it cost, and not forget that other part, even if it's not a dollar cost. We can look at and talk about lots of different sources of impact across the board for farmers. This is a busy graph that you do not need to take in all those details, but basically the deeper the red, the more significant the impact from lots of different sources, including market channel closures and shifts, by far the biggest area of impact, and an immediate one, disruption to distribution systems, multiple types of disruption, labor and health and safety challenges and pivots and adaptations that needed to be made, interruptions to the supply chain, both upstream and downstream supply chain. So on the one hand, closure or backups with processing facilities, on the other hand, difficulty getting inputs, and financial challenges, of course. And one thing that I want to note in this busy graph is the diversity of types of impacts that were experienced and the distribution of those, because on the one hand we look at closure of marketing outlets, and that was one of the most common areas of impact. And if you add up the significant and minor impacts, that's 55% who said they were impacted by direct market closures. So that's close to the 60% who earlier had said that they were overall negatively impacted. Not quite. But then there's lots of other areas of impact with smaller percentages. So that's just a slice of producers who were affected by one or the other particular type of impact. There's no one single narrative about what farms experienced during the pandemic. There was really a diversity of experiences, as we will see, having a look here. Okay, so the first, I won't go through all of these many things, but there's a couple areas of impact that were common enough that they are worth just highlighting and looking at some of the data that's behind them. So the first one would be the market closures and disruptions. So here we're looking at the percentage of producers who said that they were experiencing disrupted market channels very early on in May of 2020. So this is based on that WSDA survey that they did really early on. And it's looking by type of production. So you see aquaculture, poultry and eggs, fruit trees, or fruit and nuts and berries, different types of production. And one thing that jumps out is that it's not in just May, so that's just 2 months into the pandemic. It's not a hugely high percentage of producers who were already experiencing disruption, not quite 30%. But that number is much higher for shellfish producers, right? Because right at the start, before the start of the pandemic, in Washington, they were already being affected by disruptions to international markets, because a lot of our Washington-grown shellfish are going to markets in Asia that were already shutting down and being disrupted by the pandemic. And then, as soon as it started here with restaurant closures, that's the other really big market for shellfish growers in our state. So they got hit by like a double whammy right out of the gate, and were really heavily impacted. Now, this was from May 2020. If we add in then end of season, by the end of 2020, it's much higher impacts across the board, right? So we've got about 3/4 of producers across the board in Washington saying that they're being impacted by market closures or market disruptions. And it's just worth pointing out that this data here is jumping around, but that's from coming up to a year ago. And it's not stopping, right? Our market disruptions and supply chain disruptions are not slowing down, and this causes a lot of uncertainty, of course, in planning for what to do next year, because there's a lot of uncertainty about where are the markets going to be, where are consumers going to be, is consumer interest in local food going to stay as strong as it has been? So that was looking at the impact from market channel closures. Now let's look briefly at the impact related to labor and workforce changes. So what you're seeing here is the percentage of survey respondents who made various types of workforce changes in 2020 related to specifically because of COVID. And all the red bars are some form of workforce reduction. So reducing number of employees or employee hours, or scaling back hiring plans, all kinds of different reductions. The two gold bars are increasing the workforce, so increasing employee numbers or hours. Overall, so that's of all producers who responded. When you narrow it down to just those who actually have had employees before the pandemic, 42% said that they had reduced employee numbers or hours or hiring plans because of the pandemic. And it's definitely, and that was the prevailing narrative, right? So it was 42% reduced, some pretty small percent, as you can see there, only a small proportion increased employees, and then there were a lot of folks who said that we didn't actually have to make a change. But the largest bucket was reducing workforce. And that is despite lots of information that we received from farmers who said that they went to extraordinary lengths to try to retain employees. So there was a lot of effort, of course, going on to try to retain workforce, keep everybody working on something if at all possible, but still the narrative overall was of reducing the workforce. And we don't have to look at everything that's in that purple graph, but that is showing the leading causes or the main causes for reducing workforce. The biggest ones were financial constraints and shortages of labor, inability to find or retain or recruit workers. And this again is from last year, but based on talking with people this year and conducting these sort of interviews just a couple months ago with stakeholders in food and ag, the difficulty finding and retaining farm labor is a huge concern for the future across the board. And it's paired with real earnest concern about the value of farm work and how we understand and prioritize that sort of like the value proposition and the value of farm work and farm labor and the ability of farmers to afford to pay competitive wages for farm work. So this is, I think, going to be a big topic going forward in all sectors, agriculture definitely being one of them. And our state is no exception. Moving on to another area of impact, operating costs. So by the end of last year, 65% of producers said that they were experiencing increased operating costs for lots of different reasons though. So again, this is one of those places where, so the majority of farms had increased operating costs, but the majority of farms didn't express one particular reason, right? So we had enhanced safety and sanitation measures, that was the biggest one, but increased cost of inputs was another, increased cost of processing, additional labor expenses, increased packaging, increased distribution costs, and there's a lot of complexity under all of those. So this, if you just wanted to look at basically the cost associated with safety and sanitation measures, this shows a breakdown of all those different types of like providing PPE and doing increased cleaning, all these different measures that had to be enacted and which, for whom they were really costly and for whom they were maybe a minor cost or something that they didn't have to do because they already had it implemented. So the deep red is major cost, gold is didn't have to implement it, and then the purple is those who already had things in place. And this is also a place where farm type matters a lot, whether and how you're impacted by this. So these types of impacts were experienced by farms that had employees primarily. And in one sense, the more employees you had, the more heavily you were impacted. in another sense, there were difficulties meeting various sort of safety and sanitation regulations for farms that were very small, that had few employees, where it didn't really make sense, but they had to jump through the same hoops as much larger farms were jumping through. And so there's a real diversity of experiences interacting with how those burdens affected farms of different types and sizes. There was also one about like shellfish farmers where you had to have a porta potty on site, but they're like, we can't have a porta potty on site because it's in a tideland and you can't put a porta potty out there. So all kinds of different things. So that was a sort of a quick walkthrough of some of those really key areas of impact that we collected data on, and it's all like synthesized in these reports that are available online to point to and to explain what happened. And I'll talk a little bit now about some of the key types of adaptations that were made, and then move from there into what that sort of tells us about resilience. So one of those areas of adaptation was pivoting, and I know everyone hates the word pivot now, but pivoting between market channels. And this graph is showing basically the change in revenue between 2019 and 2020 attributable to different marketing channels for those farms who used those marketing channels. So it says like how much of your weight did you either add to or take out of a certain marketing channel in 2020 compared to the year before. And we can see things that we would expect and are common trends, right? You see a decrease of emphasis on export and on farmers markets, on restaurants, and on sales to processors. You see an increase in weight in direct-to-consumer sales and food hub sales and on-farm sales. And these all align and make sense. One thing that is notable when we sort of talk about farms of different types and particularly different sizes is that those pieces that saw the most increase during the pandemic are also sales channels that are most frequently used by smaller scale farms. We can also look at this one by location in the state, and we can see some unique trends coming out there between, there are places where Western Washington and the striped bars and Eastern Washington and the purple bars experience things similarly. There are also places where the experience was different. You can see, the much greater significance, of course, of loss of export markets for farmers in Eastern Washington than in Western Washington, and some other things like that. But there's lots of ways to break it down and to look at and to try to understand the experience of different types of farms in our state. One other piece that is interesting to note here, lots of efforts were made to refocus product into food access channels as well. And there are some great success stories there. East West Food Rescue doing like incredible work. There were bottlenecks, right, especially for some of our sort of signature crops in Washington, with the feasibility of redirecting really large volumes of produce into food access or other channels that weren't, where the supply chain wasn't able to support that change. So like washing and packaging potatoes that usually were sold in bulk to processors, there was a big hang up in the ability to sort of wash and pack potatoes. Crops like cherries and oysters that have short shelf lives requiring refrigeration or that are not familiar to home cooks, like shellfish not being familiar to home cooks, there were challenges with the idea of getting those into food banks because they're not set up to handle that kind of short shelf life produce. So that's sort of an interesting takeaway for us when we're thinking about Washington agriculture in aggregate, and what are some of those signature things in our state, and where are some of the weak points where we weren't able to pivot successfully. And needed sort of more system-wide or deliberate interventions to smooth things over there. And that can point to places for potential improvement and to build resilience to future challenges like that. Another type of adaptation basically was following changes in market channels. So pivoting with a market channel often came with modifying production plans. And again, I'm very aware that I'm preaching to the choir here, and so I don't want to tell farmers what you did during the pandemic, but it's just to highlight, like, there's data here, you can use it. So here, we're looking at the percent of respondents who said that they did different types of changes to their production plans in 2020 because of the pandemic. And you can see all these different types of changes that they made. the most frequent type of change was increasing volume of product produced. And then the very next most common change made was decreasing volume produced. Obviously, those are two different collections of farms that are saying that, right? But they're competing. Those are the two most common ones. So we've got really different experiences based on what markets people were trying to follow and what their capacity was and what their staffing was like and all kinds of stuff. Then after that, after those two, the next tied for third are either increase or decrease in product diversity. So this really drives home the idea that like farms are just not monolithic. They are unique, and there's no single narrative of what happened to farms in response to all this, to this shock and disruption. Another thing we can do with this type of information is we can break it down by farm type a little bit. So we can look at it by farm age, looking at the established versus new farms there and how likely they were to make these types of changes. We can look at it by farm size, so large versus small farms there, and by region of the state, so eastern versus western Washington there. And what you see is that in almost every one of those types of changes, it was smaller farms, farms that were newer, and farms that were in western Washington that were more likely to implement the change for almost every single one of those. A little bit of the exception being decreasing volume or removing some products. But so while we've just established that you absolutely cannot generalize across farms and their experiences, there is a trend here in which smaller, newer farms, many of which tended to be located or are located in western Washington and tend to be closer to centers of population, were in more of a position to alter their production plans to track their market changes, right? So to follow the changing market, follow the shift towards more local purchasing, more direct-to-consumer sales, and change up their production plans to match that. Okay, keeping going, another type of adaptation, and this is a really big one, is building new network connections. We were just hearing in the session before from the Eat Local First Collaborative about like the phenomenal collaborative effort that brought the Eat Local First Food Farm Finder, everything together across organizations, and partly as a product of the pandemic spurring creativity and collaboration and networking. Absolutely the same true in across producers. So more than a third of producers said that that they had formed new working relationships specifically because of COVID. New working relationships with other farmers, with other collaborative networks like food hubs, and with other food and agribusinesses. And for all of these types of new networks that were formed, it was more common among small farms and among farms that produce multiple categories of products, so more diversified farms, and among farms that had more diversified sales channels. But this is a really strong trend. Yeah?
Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's fine.
No, I was just curious now, like if you guys have plans to resurvey the same operations to see like if those relationships were maintained or if they went back to the pre-pandemic ways.
Yeah, I love that question. We can't resurvey the same businesses because it was anonymous, so we don't have a way to recontact them. We would love to make this a little bit more regular, though, to collect a regular set of information like this, so that we sort of have time points that we can look at. So that's something that we're discussing as our way to get this type of information just every year or 2 years or something like that, where we could still track percentages. But we can't actually check those individual ones. But it also is definitely one of the things when we talk about what can we take away from the pandemic, it's one of those silver linings where some really positive things happened here. We need to understand how many of them have been preserved or are likely to be, and what systems can be put in place, or what advocacy work can help to support the retention of those partnerships that have formed and to make it easier the next time around. So great question, I really appreciate that. On the flip side of that sort of organic network connection, we also asked about utilization of aid and relief programs. So more than half of the farmers who responded said that they'd applied for at least one type of relief program, COVID-related relief program. And it's definitely a fact that large farms were more successful in applying for aid than small farms were, but not by a huge margin. But there was a lot of frustration among smaller farms about eligibility constraints and sort of about a hurdle for applying or for being successful in an application. Yeah.
Do you think for the small farmers, the bigger hurdle was choosing to apply and getting through the red tape, or applying and being turned down?
I would say 3 hurdles. I think the first 2 more. So the deciding to apply, well, maybe 4, like being eligible, so saying, can I apply or not? And then deciding to apply and go through all that hurdle of application. That was probably the biggest one based on what we got in terms of written feedback from people. There were also experiences of going through all of that application process and then finding out at the end that you weren't eligible. So there was sort of like a check the box to confirm that you had such and such payroll on this date, and it's like, we have seasonal employees, we didn't have payroll in February. So so a lot of those, and then they getting turned down as well, but I would say getting turned down tended to be a little less than the earlier hurdles. Okay. So that's mainly looking at like the big federal aid programs, and I just also want to highlight, because we're sort of looking at these aid programs as things that were patching holes, that were starting to, or like, you know, loose seams in our system, right? And so another important one of those was WSDA taking the data that we're generating about who's hurting most and what's going on, and turning around with these relief and recovery programs for those 4 sectors that were most heavily, most rapidly impacted. And that was a program that was really successful, and sort of, it's one of those like, okay, so we had the big system solutions, we had our smaller statewide system solution, and they're all working together to try to figure out how to triangulate aid and relief and keep the system glued together. So thinking about those different types of adaptations, just sort of shared, the market channels, the production plan changes, the networking, aid and relief. This is a gross overgeneralization, but one thing that we can kind of see coming out of there is there's different types of adaptation. There's individual adaptations, like that can be enacted by an individual farmer and farm business, having agency to make those changes, like to decide to change their market channel or to change up their production plans in order to adapt. And those tended to be most frequent among small and diversified operations. Again, just that's a tendency. That does not mean that that's across the board, because everybody's unique. Then there were these sort of organic but system-based adaptations, like network formation, that weren't facilitated by anyone per se, but it was a broader than one farm solution, right? And those also tended to be more common among small and diversified operations. Then there are these facilitated system-wide adaptations, mainly in the form of relief programs. Also, you could say in the form of the actions of lots of farm service agencies and organizations trying to figure out how to form solutions, make connections in a facilitated way to make things continue to work. And those tended to be more heavily utilized by larger and less diversified operations that were running into some of these other blockages, like too much product to move into any single pathway and things like that. Again, so that's just a generalization, but this does sort of show up as a bit of a trend. And it's not at all of these different types of adaptations and looking at farms of different types and sizes and stuff, none of this at all is to say that one type of farm is more resilient or more adaptable or better than another type. It's really highlighting the different pathways of success and adaptation that are at play broadly across our agricultural sector. So the last snippet here, what can all this tell us about resilience? That's like the title of this session. And so to take on that, I'll come back to those farms that actually said they did well during the pandemic. So this is looking at the question of overall, were you impacted positively or negatively by COVID in 2020 as a farm business? And so, I mean, a lot of the people who said positively, that was a grudging, qualified positive. They're like, this is all bad, but okay, as a business, we actually did well. So you can see that there's the larger percent in red who said they were negatively impacted. there's a little slice there in purple, just 7%, that said no impact at all. And then there's about a third in gold, or 30% looks like, who said actually they were positively impacted by the pandemic. So we can look at that slice who said that they were positively impacted and see what kind of characteristics is behind that. Who were those farms? So if we look at it by farm size, it was a much higher percentage of small farms compared to large farms who said that they were positively impacted by the pandemic. We can look at it by product diversity as well, and you see that the farms that had more product diversification were more likely to say they were positively impacted by the pandemic. Now, interestingly, we can also look at it by market channel diversity. And when we do that, we don't see what we would kind of expect to follow along with this narrative. You actually see that, that farms with just a single market channel were a little more likely to say they were positively impacted. That's kind of interesting when we stop and think, what's that all about? So what I did there is brought back the other question we asked about financial impacts. And this one, that's if we ask not did you do overall, was it a positive impact, but financially, how did you do? Was it positive or negative? And there, it's just about a wash, but actually those with diversified market channels were more likely to do well financially, but they were less likely to say they did well overall. So there's a little bit of that reminding us what the cost of adaptation is. So that's sort of one possible explanation is, okay, you were in a better position with multiple market channels to really shift weight and pivot and do all kinds of changes to take advantage of that and do okay financially, but that came with a huge energy, stress, cost, and so you don't feel like that went well or that was a good experience, right? It's just sort of a nugget to take away from this kind of thing. Another kind of cool thing to look at here, and I'm getting towards the end, is the little purple slice of people that actually said no impact really one way or the other. And it's a small percentage, just 7%, but it's kind of interesting to see who those were. So that was a more common response among large farms. It was more common among farms with just a single product, and it was a lot more common among farms with a single market channel. And what that kind of hints at is that there were these little like pockets or islands of stability in our system too, of farms, many of which tended to be less diversified, but that just either totally avoided being impacted because their market channels or their product was not touched by the pandemic, or they were just robust enough to not really feel the impact anyway. And so when we think about what is the resilience overall of agriculture in the state, that's something that we want to think about. We've got a lot of smaller, more diversified farms who are really well able to adapt and pivot. We have some larger, less diversified farms who are able to just weather this particular challenge as well. So I'll take just a little time here to take a short detour into resilience theory, since that's what this session is supposed to be about. And this is just a long definition of resilience. And we all, I mean, resilience is at the tip of the tongue, right up there with pivot these days. But let's just look at this definition in relation to sustainability. So this is in relation to sustainability, which has been broadly defined as the capacity to achieve today's goals without compromising the future capacity to achieve them. Resilience can be broadly defined as the dynamic capacity to continue to achieve goals despite disturbances and shocks. Okay, so if we want to think about resilience in agriculture, in our state's agriculture, I want to put it in the context of a kind of fun analogy. So there's in resilience theory, there's this plateau analogy. So if resilience generally is the ability of a system to continue to function despite a disturbance, then bear with me and think about this analogy of a person on top of a plateau, which I think technically is drawn as a butte, but anyway, I'm going to call it a plateau. A person on top of a plateau, and the function of that person on a plateau system is to stay on top of the plateau and not fall off. So then let's introduce a disturbance to that system in the form of an unexpected windstorm. And you do that, the person falls off, that was not a very resilient system, right? So, but that's a really kind of helpful, fun analogy to think about different forms of resilience in. So what are the different ways in this system that we might build in resilience to that unexpected shock? One, yeah.
Band.
The fence,
Okay.
yeah, the brick wall.
We're talking about the
So one of those forms of resilience is, robustness. So giving the system the capacity to withstand shocks and stresses by absorbing them or resisting the shocks. So right, in this analogy, it's like a brick wall to hunker down behind. When we think about farms, we've got lots of examples in the state in what we saw. It could be those islands of basically resistance, resilience that we saw, who said they weren't impacted. We could see that from being able to rely on other resources, right? So existing sort of human capacity there, like saying we became lean, we worked longer hours with fewer people. It's saying we had enough internal resources to just still get it done despite the challenges. Or relying on existing financial resources, which contributes to those other costs, right? Drawing down your savings and things, but still a way to weather the shock. Off-farm income was a big one for especially for smaller farms. Increasing sales through existing channels like CSA. So it's like we already had that CSA as a tool, and we're just going to put a little more of our weight there and be okay that way. So there are lots of different ways that farms express this type of resilience, and it'd be neat to talk about that. I'd love to hear from you about what types of resilience manifested as well. I can keep running through the different ones. So there's two others. Adaptation, right? The ability to flex with shocks and stresses by shifting basically within an existing stability domain or within an existing system. So in this case, in the plateau, it's like, okay, well, just make it a little wider so that there's room to get out of the way and not get blown off the side, because you can slide for a little bit. Among farms, things like shifting production plans. So it's like we're still operating basically how we did, but we changed our production plan. We broadened our system a little bit. Or shifting to different market channels, things like that. And then final type of form of resilience, the term or whatever is transformability, but the capacity to change significantly with a shock or stress by reshaping or creating new systems. So in the plateau, that might be something like building a bridge to a more sheltered location. Among farms, it might be those formations of really novel, innovative partnerships between not only multiple farms, but farms with other types of food businesses, right? Starting processing with a local restaurant. Other things like broader food systems transformations that maybe haven't yet fully manifest, but we sort of are seeing movement in that direction. And then when we think about, okay, so what can this tell us overall about resilience in our system? One thing that we want to keep in mind too is that we want all of that. We don't want just one or the other or anything. We want a food system, an agricultural landscape that has all these multiple forms of resilience at work. Strategies that foster resilience they're multiple, they're changeable, they rely on context, and they're active. They're actively changing and adapting and shifting. Because when we start thinking about what can we take forward with it for the future, we want to recognize that no two challenges are going to be alike. So what we can learn about the stress of COVID, we need to interpret that broadly, not narrowly. No two challenges are going to be alike, and it's always going to be a different collection of farms that are more or less heavily impacted by the next challenge, and that are more or less well suited to either adapt and shift and pivot, or to hunker down and be resilient in a different way, or to transform the system. And so that diversity that we have in our agricultural landscape in this state is a really phenomenal strength and a really strong source of resilience overall as well. We'll wrap up here with just a little bit about future outlook, some of the data that came out of the survey, and some of the broader takeaways as well. So we did ask about concerns for the future, and the concerns are many. It's really shocking to see the very high percent of respondents who said that they were concerned about the capacity of processors. Many of these supply chain concerns are only getting worse in various ways, both upstream and downstream supply chain concerns, right? But so some of these major areas of concern included unforeseen expenses, these supply chain disruptions, continuing shifts in markets and consumer behavior, and difficulties therefore planning what to bank on. There are respondents who said that they are planning to downscale production just to mitigate risk. They're like, in such a volatile market, we don't want to be that exposed to that much risk, so we're just going to preemptively produce less. And then challenges with labor, and that really came across loud and clear just a couple months ago in talking with folks as one of these really big concerns for the future as well. Okay, there's some positives though, looking at future concerns and feelings and like what are we ready for. So we also asked farmers, how confident are you in your ability to adapt to future challenges based both on your personal and sort of workforce network resilience and based on your financial capacity. And in red there are those who said we are not confident. In gold are the ones that said, yeah, we are either dark gold is very confident, or the light sort of beige gold is, we're at least somewhat confident in our ability to adapt. And you can see there are some who said we're not confident that we can adapt, but overwhelmingly, producers said, yeah, we're at least sort of confident that we can adapt. We can deal with whatever's next based on especially our own resilience as a business, as a set of employees, as a social network, whatever, and kind of based on our financial capacity too. And one thing here, in other places I showed how does it break down by farm size or market diversity or anything like that. There are some little trends that are described here as some of the confidence was a little higher among diversified operations, but there wasn't any strong trend really. This type of confidence and the ability to adapt, or basically the ability to be resilient in the future, was not, didn't belong to any one type of farm. So large farms, small farms, diversified, not diversified, it was about the same. And I think that speaks to the really many different ways of adaptation and resisting and being resilient that are at play across the board here. So I want to share a couple silver linings too, and these probably resonate with everyone here, but I'll just sort of read through a couple of these really great quotes that came out of some of the interviews and the survey responses. So one person said, it seems like people are more concerned and excited about local food and local food systems. And maybe they've realized that they took those for granted in the past and are understanding how important it is to have a resilient local food system. So I'm feeling that from customers. So that's one of our really great silver linings, is this renewed or really strong focus now on the importance of local food production and our local food system. Another person said, one grocery store in Seattle started buying half a pig a week to cut up and put in their butcher case, and my contact told me she was using the COVID craziness as a way to get some new things approved by her boss. For example, buying half a pig a week from a local pork farm was not something that her boss would have signed on to before. So the ability to leverage the disruption in our system to move it in the direction of local food, basically to seize on the opportunities to move the system in directions that we know it needs to move, but there have been traditional blockages to moving. Another person said, this made people think more about our product diversity. We should look at that and try to remove some of the volatility when one of our products falls out for some reason. So businesses, doing some introspection and saying, what's my exposure to risk, and how can I change in the future to mitigate that level of risk? Oftentimes that means by diversifying, but other things just that, like, okay, we've survived this, now let's figure out how we can minimize that in the future. And then finally, this one saying, the pandemic has made me feel like my business is essential and that we're important. Because when it was only essential workers that were supposed to go to work, I was like, oh, farmers are part of that. So re-emphasizing the absolutely essential nature of farming for our society, and not only among farmers for whom that has been impactful, right, but also among the public in general. So the reason I wanted to take time to read through some of these silver linings is to think about what we can take forward. So when we think about the fact that there are already positives, which is a difficult thing to say when we're looking at so many negatives that have happened over the last year and a half, there are positives that have come out of this already, right? So the food system and the public good it delivers and the needs of people working in the food system are they're getting more attention than ever these days. The value of these diverse scales within our food system and our agricultural system have been made very clear, as have sources of weakness. New innovations and networks have been formed, and many are in the process of rebuilding, retooling, and so there is openness to change, potentially more so than there has been in the past. And so we can take some of those positives and then think towards, okay, what are the opportunities going forward? And this is drawn not just from the survey that I'm talking about mainly, but from this broader report about the state of our state's food system as well. So there is opportunity to recognize and preserve positive changes and to really advocate for the importance of doing that when we have the chance. To use lessons learned to prepare for future disruptions, those which we might predict, like climate change and extreme weather, the unpredictable, like economic shocks. There's opportunity to pursue conversations and actions to really bolster the economic viability of farmers, of farming, for farmers and for farm workers. Opportunity to embrace and promote diversity in the state's food and ag by leveraging evidence that we have of the importance of that diversity, right, of farm types and scales and sizes and all kinds of things. And opportunity to promote these sort of network and system-based solutions and innovations that we have seen how impactful, how important, what a saving grace those were for individuals, for businesses, and for our food system overall. To point to that and find ways to build that type of ability into our system more strongly for the future. And that also applies to, for instance, not just within production, but within the broader food system, distribution, supply chains. There's so much attention to our weak links in infrastructure and transportation, distribution, processing, but to really advocate for systems-based solutions to make everything stronger. So I'll quit rambling on about stuff and just say, again, so a lot of this is available in a brief that is already available online at our sort of research site website. And then a lot more is going to be available in this report to WSDA on the state of the state's food system during COVID. That covers both production and food access, as well as other supply chain disruptions. And we are hoping that was going to come out next Monday. It's a little bit hung up like in layout and stuff, but hopefully it comes out in about a week or so. And that'll be available through WSDA as well as our website. So that's it, and any other questions I'm happy to discuss. Yeah?
First of all, wow, that was like incredibly impressive. Thank you so much. Like, I'm sitting here a little bit awed by it. It's incredible. But a lot of the presentations seem to be geared towards farming as an economic enterprise and as a part of the economic world that we inhabit. Wearing a bigger food system hat, were you able to draw any correlations between like local food demand and how Washington Ag addressed local food demand during COVID? And what could that possibly mean in the future? I still assume we get a lot of our produce and things out of California, for example. And going to small grain programs, they say we still don't have a local grain economy that meets all the needs here locally. So is there anything we can learn about Washington agriculture being able to meet the demands of Washington residents? Because a huge part of Washington agriculture, as far as I understand, is export-based. And was there anything about how demands changed in the export world, too, in terms of food scarcities or food needs or something like that? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great point. I'd have to think a little bit about what numerical data we have, but there's definitely, there's certainly a lot of information, say, about those who are primarily selling to export markets, being able to, I said that there were lots of hang-ups, right? But there were also lots of success stories of being able to successfully really pivot to put a lot more of our Washington grown produce into the Washington food system. I think that was especially true for cherries, as I understand it, in 2020. But I think one thing that is kind of the opposite of what you asked, but still relevant, is we have a lot of focus on local food production. And I think that there's a great deal, not so much of data, but of momentum to study it better and to get closer with that idea of how our local produce supports our local population. While there's all this fervor around local food, there is less attention in the public eye, I would say, to producers who do sell outside of the state. And it is true that national supply chains were also really important for grocery retailers being able to get food in. It was both. It was like great success stories pulling food from local suppliers and success stories of managing to pull from national sources as well. At the same time as we hear lots about national sources that supply chains broke down and had to rely on local. So it's really, I guess I'm saying I don't have an answer. It's really a mix. There's a lot of different narratives out there. But yeah.
So along those lines, New England food systems through the University of New Hampshire and the University of Vermont actually did a large-scale exercise where they said what would have to happen if we were to, produce 30% of our food. I forget what.
Yeah, food self-sufficiency studies.
Exactly, and I thought that was just incredibly sort of helpful, productive, useful exercise that they went through, and wondering if there's any thought to do something similar, like just in the Pacific Northwest. It could be Washington or the Pacific Northwest.
We absolutely could undertake that if we felt that there was sort of a support and need for it, I would say. Yes. It's very achievable. Big effort, but achievable and potentially really useful. Yeah. Yeah.
Do you see either of these reports in the future informing maybe like wider state decisions around preparing for climate change and kind of using some of this information to inform that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, that's something that I didn't touch on at all here. But part of this is looking at the fact that producers were not just experiencing the effects of the pandemic, but also of a lot of extreme weather events over the last year and a half. And some of that second report does touch on all of that and on sort of what are we looking for towards for the future with climate change in Washington. So that second report is, it's going to be used by WSDA to help what they're thinking about in terms of, relief, recovery, and next steps and all kinds of things. And climate is absolutely part of that. I would also love to see, this is mostly about COVID, and then like footnote, oh yeah, climate change, that's a thing too. I would really love to make that front and center of sort of what we're thinking about going forward as well, and put COVID in the rearview mirror. Yeah.
So on one of your slides, you had, the data for farms that said they were not impacted at all by COVID, and that tended to be large farms with maybe a single product. And I wonder if the reason for that could be because those are also the farms that were able to successfully access federal aid. They had to plow under their potato fields, but they got paid for it, so they weren't affected. And I wonder if part of the recommendation could be, well, if small farms weren't able to get that aid and just had to work longer hours, like they need more resources to be able to apply for those grants and
Yeah, definitely a good point, and it's definitely I would say, at least in reading the write-in responses, it's definitely a sore point that that smaller farms were not as successful or not eligible. So absolutely, really good point. Yeah.
Thank you. This presentation is wonderful. CFAP, EIDL, PPP all changed over the course of their implementation. And you had multiple points in your survey data where you were receiving responses. Did you notice any changes in perception of the program or accessibility for small and mid-sized farms versus large farms over the duration of the program?
That's a great question. I'm not sure we actually have data that could answer that, but I would have to look back at it because we actually only the only two things that would touch on. I don't recall off the top of my head whether the WSDA survey touched on that, and then ours was at the end of the season. So I'm not sure that I could answer that, but it's certainly a good question. But I could look back. Yeah.
Two things. One of the things that I experienced which really surprised me was my export numbers. I export livestock to Asia actually went up a lot. I've done 3 export loads since the start of the pandemic. The other question I have, or an observation, is on the consumer side. We saw a dramatic uptick in our farm stores on buying packaged meat, but then the customer retention piece of it. As soon as Costco had shelves of meat again, the percentage of consumers that we retain isn't as high as I would have liked it to be. So how do we work on making sure that the consumer knows that we're only going to be here if you continue to support? Because the number one comment I got is, we want to make sure that you're here in the future. We want to know that you're going to be here if something happens again. But then it was really easy, out of convenience, to go back to Costco.
Yeah, absolutely. All of this flocking of support to support local farms during crisis, but it's not only during the crisis that support's needed. I think that is a question for everyone about how do we communicate that. And the only thing I can say is that the fact that this is so very much in the public consciousness and in the consciousness of decision makers, agencies, everything makes it an excellent time to spread that message and to advocate and to point to, you know, to how, what a positive thing we saw, and then how we're seeing it maybe ebb and slide back. I'd love to know more about, like, about data, you know, numbers, data experiences of that, you know, receding customer interaction or support. Anyone else have ideas or comments on that?
I'm afraid it went back to normal after COVID was over. I mean, I'm hopeful it raised awareness, like you say, but I'm just afraid, like, things go back to normal pretty quickly.
Yeah, yeah. Do you feel like it's back to normal now? Like, really?
Well, I'm thinking from a consumer purchasing.
Yeah.
Fred Meyer's looks normal again. We in the export world it's not quite normal yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our sold market in Woodinville showed a 78% growth in revenue in 2020, and we've retained not quite about 57% of that this year, which was a much higher retention than we were hoping for in that next year. But I haven't yet done the second and third quarter analysis to figure out how much of that slope happened in the second half of the year. But our education is above and beyond anything we do in terms of just classic retail business model, and even we are struggling to keep the community caring about the local food supply, and it's frustrating for sure.
Yeah.
I had a question for you about the data about the hidden impacts. Are you guys finding any data gleaning in that you're passing off to public health entities to say, okay, even these folks or our market that grew huge amounts in our gross revenue, but my staff was just wrecked at the end of the year?
That's a really good question. We haven't deliberately passed it off yet, but other than just making it available and telling as many people as we can. But yeah, any suggestions about who or where that messaging should be directed from all ears. Yeah. Yeah.
Did your data or your survey results give you any insight into what potentially might be some of the worst disturbances that we might face based on how we responded to this disturbance? I know that's maybe a little different than what your question or your data was like. That's just kind of imagining here.
You mean future, like thinking about how?
Yeah.
Oh gosh. I mean,
what are we most vulnerable to?
Yeah. I think I don't know, but my gut says twofold, right? One is how much we relied on, especially smaller farms, just digging into their own resources to get through this, which still means it turned out okay, but that's not a great system to rely on, right? So that's the one.
Well, and they're in a worse place now to weather the next one.
Exactly.
Because
they're depleted.
The benefits you guys are talking about. Yeah.
And also organizations that support the farm sector are also kind of gutted in many ways. Like there were lots of, we talked with other stakeholders, they were saying how they had lost employees, had lost capacity, were trying to do everything they could, but they're not as strong as they are either. So I think that's two parts, like realizing that farmers in many cases are depleted in all kinds of resources, and that the organizations that we rely on to help support production are also depleted, and we really need to focus on organizational capacity building, not just like grants to do things, but to be strong service organizations. And then the other real weakness is, like, this is a big ag state, and we've got a lot of product that is not as flexible as it maybe could be. So we need to think about big solutions too, for some of those areas of vulnerability where our big product categories were not able to pivot and be redirected. And I know we're officially out of time, but so I'm happy to keep talking, but
no one's leaving, so I'm going to ask my question. Knowing what you know now, magic wand, beginning of the pandemic, what is the change that you make in the Washington state food system or more broadly to mitigate the impacts that you saw in your survey?
Oh my gosh, that's a really good question.
Really good question.
I don't know. I think anyone's answer is probably as good as mine is, but what I would say is stronger I don't know how to articulate exactly, but stronger infrastructure and system structure, right? Because there was a lot of okay, that program was really helpful, but I wish it had come faster, or I wish we could have gotten that information more quickly or more smoothly, or you know, if that connection had been made early on, it would have helped. So basically, those investments in our system that are invisible, except when we really need them, that weren't necessarily all there, because we had just like phenomenal efforts by organizations, by farmers, by WSDA, by everybody doing everything they could to, you know, to keep things together. But it was all, you know, games of catch up. People are exhausted across the board. So the more we strengthen our system and the ability to function in all those unexpected ways, I think the better off we are. Yeah.
Now, to my mind, when you say system there, I see two systems. The agriculture economic sector and the system to generate income, to make jobs and so on. Then also the system to feed people in the local kind of, because there are two kind of parallel systems there. So I wonder which system, I assume you're talking there to the economic agriculture engine in the state system and not necessarily to how we feed the population system.
Well, that's a really good, actually I'm glad you raised that point, because I meant the latter sort of actually, or both, because some of those connections between how do we feed people and what does food access look like and those pipelines, and how does agriculture feed into that directly or indirectly, those were some of the ones that were like the best, you know, phenomenal success stories, but there weren't enough of them necessarily, or they didn't happen as quickly as they could have if we had more deliberate connections. We also have, so like the connection between, you know, producers and food access pipelines. Also, having to do with our transportation and logistics and infrastructure and all of that. Those are places where we know there's need, and the more we strengthen and embrace the idea that everything is connected in the food system and we better take care of all of it, I think the better off we are. Yeah.
We're just never going to let you leave here. So one of the issues that I've seen the most of is that the smaller farms are not part necessarily of the Farm Service Agency system, part of the USDA system. And all of the, for the most part, all of the funding sources that went out to existing FSA clients, because that's what the USDA created their programs around. So if you're a livestock producer, that's pretty easy to say, okay, this is who they are. If you grow corn or you grow this, you're a blueberry producer, those are known entities to them. The small diversified produce farm is not something that they're used to dealing with. Have you seen any indication that, you know, they are going to, there will be programs created that are more towards the small diversified farm? I know there's been some talk recently about creating something, but what are you seeing, if anything?
I'm not aware of anything, but that's not necessarily to say there isn't. I'm just not plugged into that sphere so much, so I can't speak to it. But it's certainly a very good point that you raise. Yep.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. And if anybody does want research group, they're up here. Yeah. How are you feeling for is this something like you came out okay and are recovered, or
yeah, you're still one of these fluctuating.
I mean, in a way we mislead, in a way we can
No.
We got a monster CSA. We did 24 weeks?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we did 22.
Yeah.
CSA.
That's a lot.
And I was like,
Yeah.